You're listening to the DolphinsTalk.com podcast network. Welcome to Dolphins Talk Weekly, your one-stop audio breakdown of all of this week's Miami Dolphins news. Now, here is your host, Kevin Durr.
This episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly is brought to you by Caneswear. Caneswear is the place to go for officially licensed apparel for the Miami Dolphins, Miami Heat, the Hurricanes, Florida Panthers, and all of the professional and college teams in South Florida. Looking for the latest jersey, a birthday gift, or the newest hat to hit the market of your favorite South Florida team? Check out Caneswear for their overwhelming selection of sports apparel. Located at 2655 South University Drive in Davie, Florida, Caneswear has it all. Not in South Florida? No worries. Visit Caneswear.com to shop their inventory from the comfort of your home, and they'll ship to you. International fans too. Caneswear.com is the spot that Miami fans shop. That's Caneswear.com, Caneswear.com. And welcome into a new episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly. I'm your host, Kevin Dern. You can follow me on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show on DolphinsTalk.com, Spotify, iTunes, wherever else you listen to your podcasts. Be sure to check out all of the articles and other podcasts on the DolphinsTalk.com website. A lot of great articles and pieces about the draft. And as we head into rookie minicamp this weekend, as I record this on a Wednesday, rookie minicamp begins this Friday. And wanted to do a follow-up episode related to the last one. The last one we reviewed the draft. This episode, I'll talk about a couple of undrafted free agents that caught my eye. I'll go over kind of some re-watching of film from some of the draft picks. And then we'll take a look at the roster and do we'll call it the way too early 53-man roster projection. As is tradition, we'll start with the whiskey segment. Got an interesting one tonight. So really wasn't feeling like a scotch. It's pretty, I won't say hot, but it's humid here in southeast Indiana. And the bourbon just sounded right, but I've only got one bottle on my shelf, and it's Tanner's Creek Bourbon. Which is made by MGP right here where I live in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. Technically, I live in Greendale, like a stone's throw away from the distillery, but it isn't very good bourbon. We'll just start with that and put that out there. But I did smoke some applewood and let it rest in there for several minutes, and it's okay now. I think I burned a couple pieces of the wood with my butane lighter. Definitely get the smokiness from the applewood, and it almost tastes like you put a few drops of like old apple juice into the bourbon. It's drinkable. Okay, I'd give this like, about a 2 out of 5 star. Normally Tanner's Creek for me is about a 1.5. It's not very good. But it is local to me. If you're wondering where in the world I'm at, Greendale, Indiana, Lawrenceburg, Indiana is about 25 miles due west of Cincinnati, Ohio. So if you take US 50 out that way, you'll follow the Ohio River all the way out to Indiana. That's where I'm at, the very southeastern corner of Indiana, where Ohio and Kentucky all have the confluence of the Ohio River right there. So that is Tanner's Creek Bourbon. Now, in the last episode, we talked about the draft picks. You guys knew my excitement level for Kenneth Grant. I love that pick. To me, I think he might even represent the best value pick in this class, just because I think there's so much more you can get out of him. He just turned 21 years old, I think last October. He already does so much so well, and he really hasn't begun to sort of refine his technique and sort of learn all those veteran tricks you're going to learn with NFL coaching and being around NFL veterans. So really excited to see how he does. And just rewatching him kind of made me kind of fall in love all over again with him as a prospect. I did some work on him for Pro Football Focus, last summer, probably right around this time, maybe a little bit later, more like end of May. But I got to watch, I think, 3 or 4 different Michigan defense tapes, and I just remember texting Travis Wingfield. I was like, I know Mason Graham's good, but I told him, like, you need to watch Will Johnson and you need to watch Kenneth Grant, number 78. And that was a pretty prophetic text. As we sit here now, a year later, but really enjoyed Kenneth Grant. And one thing I need to clarify. So this came out after the draft, the Monday after. So I was a little down on their process for trading up to take Jonas Savaianea, the guard from Arizona. Again, I really like Savaianea as a player. And my thinking was, at least from Friday, to Monday morning, was that could they have stayed at 48 and taken him? We found out later that both the Patriots and the Raiders, who picked the Miami traded out with the Raiders, and then the Patriots right after Miami were thinking about taking Savaianea. So good that they have conviction on their guy. I don't fault the process as much anymore. I still think it's a little clumsy to be trading up for a guard, but I understand it given the need and given the player. My only nit with it at this point is could you have stayed at 48? How happy would you have been with Tate Ratledge? And maybe you could have used 98 and 116 to move into the 70s or 80s and get on board that cornerback run. Started with the Jets at 73. And between 73 and pick 85, we saw Azareye'h Thomas, Savon Revel, Justin Wally, Jacob Parrish, and Noel Williams all go off the board. But the Savaianea pick, really like it. Having rewatched it, I watched Eric Smith's breakdown of him, being an offensive line coach. I see why the Dolphins love Jonas Savaianea so much. Time will tell on the process. The last time they traded up in the second round for a lineman, it was Liam Eichenberg, and you ended up passing on both Creed Humphrey, center for the Chiefs, and then Quinn Miners, guard for the Broncos. So hopefully this trade up works better this time around. The one player, I guess it's more, not that I dislike the player, I really like the player. I think Miami got fairly good value in getting Jordan Phillips in the 5th round, but rewatching him again, watching more games, I know a lot of people have come out and said, well, he's going to be the nose tackle, he's going to play like zero or a shade all the time. I'm not so sure I would try him there right off the bat. I think ultimately he'll get reps there, but I wouldn't do it right off the jump. The reason for that, if you go back and you watch, particularly the Northwestern game, is kind of what did it for me. Watch him versus the Northwestern center versus Kenneth Grant against that same center. There's way too many reps where Jordan Phillips is just getting displaced way too easily by one guy. I don't know that you could trust him right off the bat to kind of sit there and try and hold point against double teams or try and split double teams the way you can with Kenneth Grant. I think Jordan Phillips is just super, super raw in terms of his technique. Like watching him, his ability to time his get off at the snap isn't very good. He uses his hands well at times, not the way that, Kenneth Grant or Mason Graham or Walter Nolan or any of those guys did. But you're intrigued because there's power, there's explosiveness in that pop. I think if he can get his footwork down to match it and use that get off, you might be better served using him as more of a single gap attack player, putting him as a 4-eye or a 3 or a 2-eye and kind of giving him one gap and say, hey, this is your gap, penetrate the gap and block it up. He's got a pretty decent spin move, but I think he needs to learn, where to use it and how to use it. Because a lot of the reps, he's spinning around a guy, but he's spinning away from the quarterback every single time. And you're increasing your distance you have to travel to go get the sack after the move. So a lot of potential there, and I think Austin Clark, being one of the better defensive line coaches in the league, will have a good time, kind of getting that out of Jordan Phillips. But I know a lot of people are kind of pigeonholing him to like a nose tackle role because they, I think it's a counterpoint to saying Kenneth Grant isn't necessarily just a nose. I don't think either of them are necessarily just a nose, but I think moving, immediately right off the bat, week 1, I would be more comfortable with Kenneth Grant playing nose tackle reps than Jordan Phillips. Rewatched some Jason Marshall and Dante Trader Jr., the other 2 fifth-round picks. I get the why. Jason Marshall, a traits pick, did pretty well in man coverage. There's a lot of talk, which, I had heard privately at the Combine that they were thinking about playing more man. Not necessarily a switch to man-heavy stuff, but like increase the number of reps you play man-to-man coverage, which is essentially cover 1 and variations of it. I think they did that at less than 20% of their snaps last year. But you look at someone like Jason Marshall, who has that experience, they're still onto Rasul Douglas in free agency, which would make sense. Kader Kohu, Cam Smith have experience in man concepts as well as zone concepts. So I think I see what they're going with there. Rewatched some more Dante Trader Jr., and it was very interesting that Jeremy Fowler from ESPN kind of came out with his piece today saying that Dante Trader Jr., not Dante Fowler, the defensive end, Dante Trader Jr., the safety, Miami expects him to play right away, in some capacity. So maybe there's more to him than being just a jobs player. That being said, when you watch his film, the role that I would envision for him if he was going to play more is kind of the role that you would imagine Ifeatu Melifonwu playing. So I'm curious to see how that kind of bears itself out. And then Quinn Ewers, got some feedback on that. Definitely lost some arm strength, and I apologize for the sniffles. It's been pretty humid and muggy here. Both my kids are, battling colds right now at the moment, so I feel like I'm starting to get one myself. But with Ewers, I think the arm strength kind of got zapped. These injuries have built up over time. I watched the QB school with him and John Gruden. There's some messy stuff on there. He's switching up his footwork because he said NFL teams told him he needed to. Gruden disagreed with that. I think Gruden did a fair job of pointing out, like, there's too many times when he's throwing deep down the field that the ball just tends to sail on him. He gets too much air under it when he's throwing deep. If he's throwing intermediate, the ball comes out high. He can't layer it in there. Even the way Tua can layer it in those intermediate throws. So with Ewers, I think there's talent there, and I think may not happen this year because Zach Wilson's contract is guaranteed, but provided that Mike McDaniel stays the head coach in Miami after this season, I think there's potential that Quinn Ewers is the long-term backup, and who knows what happens if he gets the potential to start a chunk of games. We know what that means, from a holistic standpoint, but we'll see what he can do. I think there's certainly, the football mind, the football IQ is there. I think he needs to really pick up his pocket awareness and ability to move, and then I think you need to iron out his mechanics. Jumping into the undrafted free agents, pretty clear that Miami wants to adjust the wide receiver room. Brought in 4 different guys, Theo Weiss, Andrew Armstrong, Theo Weiss from Missouri, Andrew Armstrong from Arkansas, A.J. Henning from Northwestern, and Minari Baldwin from Baylor. Very interested in the 2 bigger guys, Armstrong and Weiss. For a bigger guy, Weiss, pretty good route runner. He's not super big, 6'3", 200, but a good route runner. Watch some of his tape from the Shrine game, and there's something there. I think at worst he stays on the practice squad and you continue to develop him, but I think there's more there than you're going to get out of like Eric Ezukama. Andrew Armstrong is the one that really intrigues me, and if I was going to pick one of those 4 receivers to make the team outright, it would be him, just because he's so sure-handed and has such a massive catch radius. Like, Preston Williams, I think, is the one receiver that Miami's had in the Tua Tagovailoa era that's been taller than 6'3". Andrew Armstrong is that. He's a big body guy. He's not going to blow your doors off speed-wise. He's not super athletic or agile. But if you need, a guy to run to the sticks and catch a pass on 3rd and 8, he can box out a defender and do that for you. So, intrigued by those two. I know a lot of people are excited about Jalen Conyers, and read through some other draft reports, and a lot of teams had him, or a lot of publications had him, getting drafted, one of the top 7 or 8 tight ends in the draft. The very astute Matt Waldman on Twitter basically pointed out that Conyers is pretty good. He runs routes pretty well. Sometimes there's a little bit of laziness to it. But he's more of a clamp catcher than a two-handed catcher. And he said that's resulted in a lot of drops, especially this past year at Texas Tech. So very interested to see how he progresses. I don't think you're going to unseat Jonnu Smith or Pharaoh Brown. That sort of seems like tight end 1 and 2, one receiver, one as a blocker. And I know they still love Julian Hill's upside as like an all-around tight end. Maybe Jalen Conyers makes it as a 4th guy or stays on the practice squad as a developmental guy, but certainly an interesting big-bodied receiving option. The offensive linemen, Josh Preeb, the left guard from Michigan, and Addison West, the center from Western Michigan, are the 2 guys that strike me as having the best chance to make it, although with Addison West, can he play something other than center? How beholden are they to Andrew Meyer? How beholden are they to Liam Eichenberg? In the case of Josh Preeb, we'll have to see there. Defensively, because they loaded up on defensive tackles in the draft, and you still have Matt Dickerson, who's, been developing. I don't know that either Alex Huntley or Trayvon Ripka are going to be anything more than a practice squad candidate. Eugene Asante, the linebacker from Auburn, intriguing as an athlete. I think he'd have to make his name on special teams. I don't think you're going to see him come in and unseat, any of the linebackers Miami has in that room outside of Channing Tindall, which do they even keep 5 on the roster this year? I don't know. To me, the guy who has the best chance on defense to make it is B.J. Adams, the corner from UCF. He's long, physical, played press man. He's got some pretty good tape out there against the Iowa State guys, against the TCU guys. It's Jalen Knoll, Jaden Higgins, Jack Besh, Savion Williams. There's a lot of good tape on him. I think the other issue is he's got some bad tape against guys who weren't drafted. So you have to sort that out. But I think that play style kind of lends itself to what Miami wants to do. John Saunders, the safety from Ole Miss, is the one I can't wrap my head around. 11 interceptions in his collegiate career, but going back through and watching that, there's only like 2 or 3 where he's actually making like a read and undercutting a pass and making an interception. A lot of them are, the quarterback sailed a throw or the pass was deflected and he ended up there in the right spot, which is good. He's got a pretty good, peanut punch in terms of knocking the ball out, but he tries to throw it a lot versus just making a tackle. So certain things you're going to have to kind of coach out of him. But this feels like a pretty strong UDFA class compared to what Miami normally brings in. And, in the McDaniel era, we've seen them bring in, I think, Kader Kohu made it, his rookie year. They had called up Braylon Sanders at one point. There was a safety that got called up a couple times that year. I can't remember his name. The next year, they had Chris Brooks. Julian Hill made the outright roster. Braden Pilley, Ethan Bonner. This past year, they had Storm Duck and Andrew Meyer. So they've had at least two guys, contribute from their UDFA class. So it wouldn't surprise me if you got like Andrew Armstrong, BJ Adams, and maybe Jalen Conyers on your roster, at some point this season from the UDFA class. So a stronger class than I think Miami's had in the McDaniel era. I'll take another sip of the Tanner's Creek bourbon apple combo there. So addressing some of the issues, we had the whole Tyreek Hill thing, and I don't want to get into that debate. I think Kyle Krabs did an excellent job of laying out lessons Miami's learned. You've paid so much money to these hired guns, and it's cost you the opportunity to re-sign your homegrown talents, Wilkins, Hunt, Van Ginkel, guys that should be core pieces of your roster that aren't anymore because you've gone out and you've traded for Bradley Chubb, though he seems to be one of the guys that's ingratiated himself well to the culture in the locker room. But Tyreek Hill, just doing whatever he does. Jalen Ramsey just being mercurial. I think Ramsey, it's just a matter of time before they trade him. Tyreek Hill, I think the buyer's remorse is kicked in, and Kyle made the point, like, he's not really a tradable asset, and then you owe him $36 million next year. No team's going to want to take that on. So you're almost going to have to try and buy off some of that contract to get, a late day 3 asset for him, in my opinion. But, I couldn't care less about what he says on TikTok or Twitter or whatever. It's Tyreek being Tyreek. We know there's some tension between he and Tua, between Tyreek and Waddle now. You've got to get the bad soldiers out of the group. And to me, that's Hill to a lesser extent, but still in that bucket, Jalen Ramsey. And I think that's a lesson for Chris Grier, Mike McDaniel moving forward, as they kind of reset and rebuild this roster. They're getting tougher in the trenches. As Kyle pointed out, you can make the argument, do they deserve this opportunity? Does Chris Grier deserve a 10th season, to try and get this thing right? I say hell no, but he's still here. So we'll have to see how far that carries. But you look at the roster that they've built. Let's try and examine it kind of position group by position group and make a way too early 53-man roster. And that'll be a nice, fun episode, quick one compared to the last draft recap. So I think starting on offense, we'll just do offense, defense, special teams. We'll build it out. Actually, let's start with special teams. So Jason Sanders is going to make it one of the best kickers in the league. I think at punter, you're going to get Ryan Stonehouse there. The special teams coach was his coach in Tennessee. Wouldn't surprise me one damn bit if Neeland Hibbett, the undrafted free agent long snapper from Alabama, beats out Blake Ferguson. More to that story that I can't share just yet, but just know that, in my opinion, it's stupid that Blake Ferguson is still on the roster. Should have been cut last year in the middle of the season. But that'll come out at a later time. So I'll take Sanders, Stonehouse, and Hibbett as my 3 specialists. So we're playing with 50 spots. So at quarterback, because of Tua and because of his injuries and how frequently and for how long he's stayed out, seemingly every time now for the past 3 seasons, going back to 2022, I feel like the Dolphins almost have a different set of circumstances than the other 31 teams, where you almost have to keep a third quarterback, even though there's the new practice squad quarterback rule. I think they keep all three. I think Tua, Wilson, and Quinn Ewers are all on the opening day roster. So that's 3 out of the 50 spots we have remaining. At running back, I know there's still an emphasis for them trying to have Jalen Waddle be involved in the passing game, whether that's him lining up in the slot, whether that's him catching passes out of the backfield, whether that's him lined up out wide as an X or a Z. I know that's something that they want to do, and I think they're banking on Jalen Wright very much fulfilling the Raheem Mostert role that we saw him play in 2022 and especially 2023 after they drafted Achane. Achane's still going to get his carries. I think you're still going to get him 15 to 20 touches a game, but maybe it's a little more balanced moving forward. And I think you'll see Jalen Wright's, touches ought to be at least double digits every game. They're pretty high on him. The Ollie Gordon pick, unless they're really intent on running more like inside zone, duo, or some gap stuff, which would make sense given, the size of James Daniels and Jonas Savaiinaea that they added and the physicality that those guys bring. Ollie Gordon and Alexander Mattison to me seems like a toss-up. I would guess you'd probably want to give it to Ollie Gordon. Miami's pretty much always kept 4 running backs and kept 3 active on game day. So I think both of those guys make it, and it's just a matter of which one's active. So now you're at 7 guys, plus Alec Ingold is a fullback, so that's 8. At receiver, we kind of talked about this on the last episode, but you have Hill, Waddle, Malik Washington, Nick Westbrook-Ikine. Those are your 4 guys. When you factor in, assuming Tyreek Hill is a Dolphin, which we think he will be, assuming that, when you factor in Devon Achane's usage, when you factor in Jonnu Smith's usage in the passing game, those 2 guys plus Hill and Waddle are your top 4 pass catchers and top 4 target getters. So Washington and Westbrook-Ikine are 5th and 6th in the pecking order. So it's probably less than 35 targets on the year, maybe 40 at most. I think it would behoove Miami to add a big target, which is why I like Andrew Armstrong. I think it's why they still keep Eric Ezukama coming to camp. It's why they've kept like Tariq Black as a futures player on the 90-man roster. He's got some size. I think they want that diversity and not just the Legion of Speed, out there, the Legion of Zoom or whatever they want to call it. So I think you have the top 4, and I think Andrew Armstrong makes it, and I think they cap it at 5, just because you have weapons at the other spots. I think so. We've got 5 receivers, and then I think 8 backs, so we're at 13 on offense. I think tight ends, I think they go with the chalk and have Jonnu Smith, Pharaoh Brown, Julian Hill. But it wouldn't surprise me if Conyers is kept on the practice squad and ultimately makes it to the active roster at some point. So you're up to 16. I think they'll keep 9 linemen. So your starters, I don't know necessarily where they're going to play James Daniels. He's hinted that he's going to be the right guard. But I think that's also contingent on how comfortable Savaiinaea is at wherever they line him up. So you'd have Paul, Savaiinaea, Brewer, Daniels, Jackson. Those are your 5. The offensive line depth seems very shaky to me. Like, that's an area I think the Dolphins still need to address. If I had to call it right now, I would say, Larry Borum and Keon Smith are your tackles, which scares the daylights out of me because Larry Borum's film is just a catastrophe, to put it kindly. Keon Smith has played, I think, 70 snaps in the NFL, and he's coming off a torn ACL. I think Andrew Meyer makes it just because he made it last year. Still hasn't played a single snap in the regular season because Aaron Brewer was durable and very good. And then, as much as it pains me to say it, like, I think Liam Eichenberg, just because of his versatility, can play all 5 positions. I think he makes it. So that would be your 25 guys on offense. And I didn't intend to really do a 50-50 split out of those 50 spots, but that's how it ends up. I think defensively, we'll lump the edge rushers and defensive tackles together and just call it one D-line group. So I think your D tackles, I think Kenneth Grant and Zach Sealer are the starters. That's a formidable duo, day one. I think Benito Jones makes it, he had his best year in the system, and you can still play him anywhere from a 0 to a 3. I think Jordan Phillips makes it, and I think you end up with one of the two between Matt Dickerson and Zeke Biggers. This will disappoint a lot of fans, but I'll go with Matt Dickerson just because there's really no one else that can line up out wide and play as like a base end in those under and over fronts that they want to run, at least at this juncture. So I'll take those 5 D tackles. Your edge players, I'll take Chop Robinson, Jalen Phillips, Bradley Chubb, Quentin Bell, and I think I would probably go with Mo Kamara. They didn't really bring in any edge guys in this year's class. I think they want to develop Mo still. Whether he takes to it or not, we'll see. But that'd give me 10. I think, 4 off-ball linebackers, Brooks, Tyrell Dodson, Willie Gay Jr., KJ Britt. I about said Kenny Britt, the old Titans receiver. KJ Britt, the linebacker who came over from Tampa. So we're at, 14? So 11 defensive backs, which feels about right. This might be the hardest room to pick, just kind of based on what you're doing, because Jalen Ramsey's going to be gone. And I'd have to imagine they sign at least 1, if not 2, free agents or sign someone or trade for someone to add to this room. So I'll use Rasul Douglas as the placeholder for the moment. I think they make a veteran addition there. So I'll say you have Douglas, Kader Kohu, Cam Smith, Jason Marshall, Storm Duck, and then I think they'll keep Artie Burns because he's developed into a good special teams player. First round bust as far as a corner goes, but he's a good special teams player. So 6 guys there, which gives me enough room for 5 safeties, which this could be a little tricky depending on, how guys develop. Ifeatu Melifonwu, Ashton Davis, I think are your starters. I think Dante Trader Jr. can probably fulfill enough jobs to get playing time and earn a role. Patrick McMorris, I think they like him a lot. And, Elijah Campbell, someone that Coach Weaver has mentioned by name in the past. He's always been a special teams guy. Hard for me to see them getting rid of him unless, someone like John Saunders Jr. or another defensive back type just blows it up on special teams in the preseason. So that's my 53 right now. I think the Dolphins still need to address offensive line. I hope they're not done. I know Chris Greer made the comment about investing in offensive linemen, and they have. Patrick Paul is a second-round pick. Savaiane is a second-round pick. Austin Jackson's a first-round pick. You gave decent 3-year contracts to both Aaron Brewer and James Daniels. So you've invested in a top 5. I wouldn't exactly call the deals that they gave Larry Borum and Liam Eichenberg, investments. I get they are from just pure definition of the word perspective, but I don't think those are sound investments that you're going to get a lot of return on. Andrew Meyer, we think he's good, but we don't know. He's never played a regular season snap. And Keon Smith, it's a limited sample size, and he's coming off a major injury. I think you still need to make a play there. I know Joe Noteboom just signed with the Ravens. That would have been a name I would have looked at in terms of free agency. Curious to see what they do there post June 1st and see if they add a body or two to that unit before camp. I'm not entirely convinced that they're done at defensive line. I think if a veteran comes available that they like, whether it's a tackle or an edge player, they may make an addition there. They had their dalliance with Joey Bosa, which would have been a pretty handsome contract for a 1-year deal. I think they were at 1 year, like $9 million. It's interesting to me that they, were on to him, didn't draft anybody on the edge, didn't sign any undrafted free agent edge players. So there's something there. And I think the secondary, you probably still need multiple additions. We know that they've been linked to Rasul Douglas, formerly of Buffalo, and Mike Hilton, formerly of Cincinnati. I've also heard, at least one person who I trust a lot has mentioned possibly trading for Jalen Watson, the corner from Kansas City, who's in the final year of his rookie deal, but a bigger physical press man corner. So I'd also, Ashton Davis as a starter scares the daylights out of me, the same way I was concerned about Jordan Poyer last year. Like, just that feels like a risk that's not worth the reward in any shape of the word. Maybe I'll eat my words, but that one feels like a pretty big risk to me. I think you ought to look and see what happens with free agents after June 1st there. And then who knows, maybe a long snapper. Like, I don't feel warm and fuzzy about an undrafted free agent battling Blake Ferguson, but they got good work out of like 5 different guys there last year. So we'll see on that. But that's my 53-man roster. I gave you my thoughts on some of the undrafted guys. Next big milestone is the schedule release, although I have heard the game in Madrid is mid-November. So we'll see if my source comes through on that. And I think people will appreciate the bye week as well this year, where it is, if my source is correct on that. So that's all I've got for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Kind of a quick pass through of the roster and some draft thoughts. I'll probably do another episode next week after the schedule release and after rookie minicamp, and we'll go from there. Thanks for listening. You can follow me on Twitter at KevinMD4. You can follow the show at DolphinsTalk.com, Spotify, iTunes, wherever you're listening to your podcasts. Be sure and check out the other authors and podcasts on DolphinsTalk.com. That's going to do it for me. Have a great rest of your week, everybody. And fins up. This episode of Dolphins Talk Weekly was brought to you by Caneswear. Caneswear is the place to go for officially licensed apparel for the Miami Dolphins, Miami Heat, the Hurricanes, Florida Panthers, and all the professional and college teams in South Florida. Looking for the latest jersey, a birthday gift, or the newest hat to hit the market of your favorite South Florida team? Check out Caneswear for their overwhelming selection of sports apparel. Located at 2655 South University Drive in Davie, Florida, Caneswear has it all. Not in South Florida? No worries. Visit Caneswear.com to shop their inventory from the comfort of your home, and they'll ship to you. International fans, too. Caneswear.com is the spot that Miami fans shop. That's Caneswear.com. Caneswear.com.